Yeah, I always thought the most revealing question was Robert De Niro or Brad Pitt. But I learned a lot sitting backstage and watching who stood up and who didn't, so I've got a good feel for the crowd. I consider it absolutely an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to you for the next, there's no counter, next 17 and a half minutes, and I'll be joined a little bit later by Sandra Joyce. So I'm going to give a little bit of a historical perspective of my experience in cybersecurity since 1993 to 2017. Sandra Joyce is going to come up and give, so what did we witness in 2018? And then we're going to talk about what do we think is next based on what we've witnessed. One of the things I also want to do at the front is just thank all the men and women that are here at RSA, that cybersecurity is your calling. And I appreciate all the work that you do, and let's hope that that work becomes easier to do every single year. And everything I'm speaking about is based on direct observables, just things I've experienced. I may be wrong. I may have had different experiences than many of you as you were practitioners over the last several decades or even before I started doing this. My first job was computer security at the Pentagon, and I have to admit it wasn't my first choice. I got stationed as a second lieutenant to the Pentagon, and the best I can recall, all the other choices didn't seem very enticing, so I chose computer security as the least bad of the other 5 choices. And 27 years later, here I stand. Can't do math very well, 26 years later. So the first generation of cyber incidents that I saw comes from that perspective of I was in the United States Air Force, and at that time, when we saw intrusions and the first one that I saw was in 1995. From 1995 to 1998, the intrusions that we saw were servers being compromised, they were on the internet, it was Unix systems being compromised. Ultimately, when we did the forensics, the exploits were publicly available. The code to do the exploits was usually publicly available. It was a technical challenge. We didn't have lawyers showing up, we didn't have business line owners showing up just yet. And anything we saw was either government on government, or it was, in fact, an attractive nuisance. And probably the first case that I ever worked was in the summer of either 96 or 97. And I should say the first case where I saw evidence that made me go, okay, this is going to change things, was I was doing network security monitoring at a site where back then, whenever we did consensual monitoring, we did have to brief the judge, advocate general that we're getting fruitful responses to our monitoring on a daily basis. So for those of you that think the government watches everything all the time, at least when I worked for the US government, we did not, and we had to go through lots of approvals to do so, and it was pretty aggressive when we did. We would monitor and minimize as much as possible. And on the first day that we did this network monitoring at a university, the first thing I witnessed was, it was the next day because I had to post-process, and get this, it was libpcap format files, had to replay them and write our own replay. We saw somebody come in from, at that time, it was registered to the Beijing Communications Bureau, come into this university, use an account that used to belong to a student that graduated a year before, and from that account, they did nothing more than, back then, telnet, and they telnetted to at least 25 military bases in the first connection that I saw. And what was amazing about this session, what made it different than other things I'd responded to when I was in the Air Force, was I already saw division of labor. Somebody was logging in, they would hit Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, then Brookhaven, then Oak Ridge, then Los Alamos National Labs, and they were just validating credentials. So whoever it was, telnet to a site, and the very first command they did when they got a prompt is just go to the next one. And all the user accounts and passphrases weren't the same. So they already had, in my opinion, someone over there had figured out, let's vet the accounts we have, let's make sure they work, and then there was like a different persona or a different group potentially that was coming in behind using those accounts to do things. But bottom line, 1993, that's when I started doing this. By 1995, 96, we're seeing, at least the cases that I worked, we would have attributed at that time to Russia or China, but I have a very US-centric set of experiences at that stage. Right around 1996 is when I think Windows NT starts to propagate, and you can now point and click to do a server. People are going online to make money, and you're starting to get web servers running NT 3.86. You have IS web servers going out there, and you're having the databases storing credit cards either on the same machine or just one hop away with no segmentation in between. And we see cybercrime hit this. So you have the ongoing state versus state. But now you enter new operating system, you enter new way to make money, and wherever money goes, crime follows, and we started responding to much more incidents that involved making money. And just yesterday I was talking to a reporter, Joseph Mann, who wrote a book on the cult of the dead cow, and I started thinking about it. In the 90s, everybody starts hearing about hacking because of things like what they did at Loftcrack, what they did with the cult of the dead cow, with Back Orifice. And I remember my war story from that era. They're never really that fun because I remember a lot of times when an attack came out, there wasn't an available patch. We didn't get that battle rhythm yet as a community. Find, 0-day, patch quickly, good to go. I remember an attack called the MDAC attack in 2000. There's a DLL that shipped with Windows NT IS web servers that was vulnerable, and just somebody was spraying the whole internet. And I remember spending my Halloween, which in my 20s is still a great holiday, and I had to go from computer to computer at a major bank just patching machines to make sure it didn't happen. So cybercrime's here to stay. It's changed more recently, but again, I didn't see a change. So the third phase in my career of just responding to breaches, figuring out what happened and what to do about it, came when I got a phone call from somebody, and I could tell that the groups that I was responding to in the US military that were hacking the US military had pivoted to the United States Defense Industrial Base. And at that time, it was a targeted spearfish. There was no defense for it, and I felt that the private sector was sitting ducks for what we were going to see if this pivot occurred. That pivot did occur, and we saw espionage units starting to broaden their targeting, broaden the scale at which they operated, and now we have attacks that are government on government and government versus private sector, which I always said equated to your grandparents in an ultimate fighting championship bout. It's not pretty. The governments will beat the private sector when they start doing that, and we have to live with that even today. And you're going to see an acceleration then of phases, because for the first 20 years of my career of doing computer security, I had only 3 phases. In August of 2013, all of a sudden, we're starting to deal with something called the Syrian Electronic Army. We hadn't heard of them before, and it took me that long, 18 years of responding to breaches, before I saw a pattern between geopolitical conditions and what attackers were doing, and I had to hear it from somebody else, in fact. I just would show up as a nerd and go, here's what happened, here's what to do about it, let's get out of Dodge. Suddenly, we're responding to media. They're being compromised with the Syrian Electronic Army, and at that time, there's use of chemical weapons in August of 2013 by Assad troops against Syrian rebels, and the United States had a doctrine to intervene in the use of chemical weapons anywhere in the world. So there was basically a threat of armed conflict at that point, and we saw whoever the Syrian Electronic Army was, they were using hacking to get their message out. And I know I missed plenty of examples on that. Hacktivism has been around a lot longer. But what I want to show you is the acceleration of phase changing, because in 2014, something else also happened. We'll get back to 2018. In 2014, November of that year, right before Thanksgiving, I got a call about the Sony breach, and one of our frontline folks responding to that breach says he thinks it's North Korea. 2015, August of 2015, something I've never seen in my whole career happens all in one month. We see in August of 2015, Chinese cyber espionage campaigns come way down, and they didn't change their methods. They just literally decreased volume of attack against the United States 1 month before our head of state met with their head of state to have a treaty signed. And at the same time frame, we saw Russia do 3 things differently. 1, start targeting universities, not for defensive purposes, but to steal the email of anti-Putin professors. 2nd, they stopped doing the counter-forensics and OPSEC that I was used to seeing in forensics. And 3rd, we were responding to breaches, putting eyes on target. They knew we were watching them, and they didn't seize their activities, which meant they were getting a little bit more bold. So a lot of change in 15. In 2016, we saw additional changes. In 2017, I kind of dubbed it the year of Iran and the year of the propagating spreaders. You have WannaCry, you have NotPetya and Petya, and these are things that are indiscriminate, go out and hack what you can and create lots of collateral damage. So you're seeing an acceleration of the phases that we're going through in cybersecurity. And now I'd like to welcome to the stage our Senior Vice President of Threat Intelligence, Sandra Joyce. She's going to take the lessons we learned from frontline responders, from over 150 threat analysts that speak 32 languages that reside in 19 countries, and from thousands of our product customers, and she's going to bring that to light. So Sandra, would you please join me? Sandra, you have 9 minutes and 48 seconds now.
Great.
So let's get right to the point.
Okay.
2018, let's see some of the observables there of what you saw and what the team concluded.
Well, as the head of threat intelligence, I never get to tell good news, but I actually have some good news for you today. We publish M-Trends every year, and these are the indicators and the events that are happening as we do our incident responses, and what we learned from there. And what we saw was that dwell times continue to drop globally, and this is very important, because most incidents that happen actually start with legitimate credentials. So you really need to pay attention to what's happening post-breach. And what we saw was the median global dwell time drop in 2011 from 416 days down to 78 in 2018. So that's good news.
We have more good news later, but we want to spread it out. So I want to get right to some of the modern nations. And by the way, we're not anti-China, we're not anti-Russia. We go where the breaches are, we do attribution, because we think if you hold people accountable, you can at least impose risks or repercussions, or at least have dialogue about rules of engagement. It just so happens that the first country I would like to talk about is North Korea, and some of the observables we have on what they did in 2018.
Right, so we have two groups I want to talk to you about in North Korea that we looked at in 2018 very specifically. So one of them is APT37, and this is a North Korean sponsored group. And the reason it was really interesting to us in 2018, and we wanted to tell the global security community about it, was because we watched this group, we used to call it Reaper, just target very locally to the peninsula. But then we watched it evolve over time. We watched it become more technically sophisticated, started to use and exploit 0 days. They started to target internationally, and they even had some evidence that they had destructive malware. They hadn't used it yet, but we thought this was definitely something we needed to keep an eye on. And North Korea continues to punch above its weight class, definitely.
And there's more out of North Korea. I'm fascinated by the next group.
Right, the next group is APT38, and the reason this is really interesting is before, we used to always think of nation states really as purely espionage, doing the things that carry out national security goals. And what we saw was a group, APT38, that was actually financially motivated. Now remember that North Korea exists pretty much outside of the international financial system. They have the pressure of sanctions, and their APT38 was incredibly sophisticated at using espionage skills to steal money from financial institutions all around the world. So this was basically bank robbers with the skills of spies, and they, not just that, once they would move the money out, and I'm talking hundreds of millions of dollars, once they would do that, they would deploy destructive malware to distract our incident responders. So this was something we definitely wanted to put out publicly so that people could be aware of it.
That's fantastic. Now, North Korea is not alone. A lot of other nations are developing offensive capability and following, it's not like they publish their cyber doctrine, and here's what we will do and here's what we won't do. What did Iran do in 2018?
Iran was really interesting because APT39 is a group we've also been tracking for a while. But what we saw with this one that was really unique was that it was carrying out national security goals that were really targeted to individuals. So telecommunications industry, travel industry, they were less about the organizations they were targeting and more about actual individuals that were of interest to the Iranian government.
Okay, and again, I did dub 2017 from my perspective inside of the walls of fire, the year of Iran. It was a year where we responded to breaches from Iranian threat actors, or what we would have attributed to Iranian threat actors, almost as much as from Russia or China. So I think they're getting much more active. And by the way, We have internal bets on what's the next nation we're going to start seeing out there as we do our attribution. Have to have a conversation about China and how prolific they are.
Right, and China never really stopped stealing intellectual property, but what we saw them do differently was they started to change from commercial IP theft after the Obama-Xi agreement, and we started to see them actually really focus on military and dual-use technologies. One group in particular, APT40, really stood out to us because they've been doing traditional espionage for a long time, but this is something where they're really promoting a very international agenda through the Belt and Road Initiative, and also to uphold the maritime and naval capabilities of Chinese government. And so we've watched what a group that we used to call Periscope, APT40, would go ahead and target organizations that had anything to do with the Belt and Road Initiative to further their agenda.
And then, the big four, when you look at Western targets and what nations are attacking those Western targets, what could you tell us about what Russia's activities were like?
Well, Russia continues to be very disconcerting for us. When we think about them in 2015, 2016, Sandworm team targeting the Ukrainian electrical grid. And then they moved on in 2017 to an ICS framework where they used Triton malware. And the thing that was really disconcerting about this was that it wasn't just about espionage or anything like that. They actually targeted the safety systems of an ICS plant. And that means that was the last step. I mean, the safety systems at an ICS facility are the last thing between, that risks human life there. So that actually resulted in the shutdown of the entire plant, something that we don't think was actually intentional.
Wow. So I got to ask, Sandra, we got 3 minutes and 40 seconds. What's next? So we brought you through from 1993 till now as fast as we could talk, New Jersey auctioneer speed. What's next from your perspective?
Unfortunately, if things continue the way that they are, with brazen actions, increasingly destructive and disruptive attacks, with no guardrails on it, I think people are going to get hurt.
I think people are going to get hurt. You want to expound on that, or?
Well, what we're seeing is that sometimes even the main target of what some of these destructive attacks are doing don't actually end there. We're seeing secondary and tertiary effects. If you look at NotPetya, that might have been targeted at Ukraine because it used a software update mechanism in EmiDoc, which is a tax preparation service. But we all know what ended up happening. Tens of billions of dollars were actually resulted in damage from that, and we're not sure that was actually the original intent. So as these things continue to get out of control, we really need to think about what steps could be taken to curb those threats.
Well, Sandra, I want to thank you very much. I love
Thanks,
the
boss.
stories about 2018, and in the next 2 minutes and 20 seconds, I'll tell you what I think is next.
You.
Thank you, Sandra. And by the way, some of you will be saying, well, where's the United States in all this? We report what we see, so if the United States is on offense, they must be doing it in countries that don't hire us to respond. And they're not hacking for money in the United States. So what is next from my perspective? One of the things that I do believe in is we are going to have to come up with a set of rules. The asymmetry between offense and defense, it's always harder to defend. I've always used the 1980s analogy. That's how long I've been doing this. It's when you're up against nations, and every time we meet a victim compromised by one of these groups, they're not just the military, it's not the government, it's the private sector being compromised. And they're starting to go, why would a nation hack us? It's because we don't have established rules, and we're starting to set baselines where we expect certain industries to withstand cyber military attacks. So I think it'll go a long way for all of us to figure out how do we stop the escalation in cyber. And when I look at 2018, by the way, it's my conclusion, and I try to read all our forensic reports, I didn't see an escalation in 18 compared to 17. It's almost like the whole global actor sphere said, hey, let's kind of plateau a little bit. The thing is, all we can determine about doctrine is by what we observe. And I know there are groups working on doctrine, but because of the asymmetry, that one good hacker can create the work for all of us defenders, it's just an unfair fight right now, and it'll change the way of life. The second thing that I think will happen is the world's already starting to balkanize the internet based on expectations of privacy, anonymity, and identification, period. It's just starting to happen. You see with data sovereignty issues, you can see that privacy is a cultural decision by either the regimes that run countries or by the populations, depending on government type, and it doesn't appear that one set of rules fits the whole internet. And we should expect that, but what I'm witnessing over the last few years, and as I travel the globe, I do feel like there's more of a compartmentalizing of the data, countries kind of circling the wagons on their perimeters, and the great thing that connected us is kind of coming and closing in a little bit. And the last thing I'd say is, as we come up with rules for how countries should behave during times of peace, we'll have nations that abide by them, nations that don't, nations that wish they could but don't even have the IT infrastructure to prove they are. The citizens in the nations that can't abide by those rules will end up having drastically different experiences on the internet than the folks that are in a more free world. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.